200 Comanche warriors don't just appear at your doorstep by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. And Thaddeus Bear Mallister was about to discover which one it was. Picture this. Dawn breaking over the Texas prairie. August 16, 1876. The air already thick with heat and tension. Bear stands alone in front of his cabin, unarmed, watching as dust clouds roll toward him like an approaching storm. But this isn't weather. This is something far more dangerous. The sound reaches him first, hooves pounding the earth in perfect rhythm. Then he sees them, warriors on horseback, emerging from the morning mist, like spirits materializing from another world. They spread out in a perfect semicircle, tightening around his property like a noose. Every single one painted for war, feathers catching the early light, weapons glinting. And at the front of this army sits a man who can only be Chief White Bull. Massive, imposing, his face carved from stone and fury. But to understand why 200 warriors wanted one cowboy dead or alive, we need to go back 36 hours. To the moment Bear made a decision that would change everything. To the choice that brought an army to his door. Thaddeus Bear Mallister was 34 years old, but the Texas sun and grief had aged him beyond his years. His hands were calloused from working cattle. His face weathered from spending more time outdoors than in. He ran a small ranch somewhere between Amarillo and nowhere, the kind of place most people pass through without noticing. Every morning started the same way. Up before dawn. Coffee so strong it could strip paint. Then out to tend the cattle, mend fences, fix whatever the unforgiving prairie had broken overnight. It was hard work, lonely work, but Bear preferred it that way. Solitude hurt less than company. 3 years ago, cholera had swept through the territory like a reaper's scythe. It took his wife, Sarah, first. She'd been feeling poorly for 2 days. Then one morning she just didn't wake up. Their son Matthew, only 7 years old, followed 3 days later. Bear found them both in their beds, cold and still, looking almost peaceful if you didn't know they'd suffered. He buried them on a hill overlooking the creek, planted wildflowers that Sarah had loved. And every week since, he replaced those flowers with fresh ones. In his cabin, on the small wooden table, sat a tintype photograph. Sarah and Matthew, frozen in time, their faces worn from Bear's constant handling. That photograph was surrounded by dried wildflowers, changed religiously every 7 days. It was the only ritual that gave his life any meaning anymore. The other ranchers considered Bear different, maybe even soft. While they organized raids against the Comanche, he stayed home. While they gathered in town to plan retaliation for native attacks, he kept working his land. They'd say things like, "Bear doesn't hate anyone. He's just sad all the time." And they were right. Bear had seen enough death. He didn't need to create more. But the territory was changing. Summer of 1876 brought increasing tension between settlers and the Comanche tribes. Raids were becoming more frequent. 3 ranches had been burned in the past month. 2 families killed. At the last town meeting, the message had been clear. Shoot first. Ask questions never. Bear had attended that meeting, listened in silence, then left without saying a word. Because what could he say? That violence only breeds more violence? That revenge never brings back the dead? They wouldn't understand. They hadn't lost what he'd lost. August 15th started like any other day. Temperature already hitting 95 degrees by 9 in the morning. Bear was working on the north fence line near the creek, the only reliable water source for miles. His hands worked automatically, muscle memory from years of repairs. But something felt off. That prickle on the back of your neck when the world's about to shift. The air too still. The birds too quiet. And then he saw movement near the water. Something small. Stumbling. At first, Bear thought it might be a wounded animal. The figure was moving in unsteady zigzags, the way creatures do when they're dying. But as his eyes focused, his blood went cold. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Even from a distance, Bear could see she was in trouble. Her movements were weak, uncoordinated. Every few steps, she'd stumble, catch herself, keep going with pure determination. She was heading for the creek, for water, driven by the most basic human need. Bear's first instinct, the one drilled into him by years of frontier survival, was to reach for his rifle. In these parts, an unexpected Native American on your property meant danger. It meant raids. It meant possible death. Most ranchers wouldn't hesitate. They'd shoot first and sleep soundly that night, convinced they prevented an attack. But Bear's hand stopped halfway to his weapon, because even from this distance, he could see how small she was. How vulnerable. This wasn't a warrior. This wasn't a threat. This was a child who needed help. He set down his tools carefully and began walking toward her. Slowly, hands visible, movements deliberate and non-threatening. His heart was pounding, but his steps were measured. He knew approaching too quickly would terrify her, might send her running. And, in her condition, running could kill her. As he got closer, the full extent of her suffering became apparent. The girl's traditional Comanche clothing was torn and filthy, hanging off her thin frame in tatters. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and sweat, tangled beyond recognition. But it was her face that hit him like a punch to the gut. Her eyes were too large for her gaunt face, sunken with dehydration. Her cheekbones protruded sharply. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. This child hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. Bear stopped about 15 feet away. The girl noticed him then, freezing like a rabbit that spotted a fox. For 5 long seconds, they just stared at each other. Two people from different worlds, separated by language, culture, and a war neither of them had started. Bear could see terror in her eyes. But underneath that terror, something else. Hope. Desperate, dying hope. She spoke then. Rapid Comanche words that Bear couldn't understand. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a croak. But her meaning transcended language. She pointed to her mouth with a trembling hand. Then to the creek. Then back to her mouth. The universal language of hunger and thirst. The plea that every human being understands regardless of what words they speak. Bear thought about his neighbors in that moment. He thought about Pete Morrison, who'd shot a Comanche boy last spring and called it preventive justice. He thought about the town meeting and the calls for blood. He thought about what the smart thing to do was, the safe thing, the thing that would keep him alive and his neighbors from turning on him. Then he looked into those desperate eyes again, and he saw Matthew. He saw his son, who'd looked up at him with that same desperate hope when the fever had taken hold, who'd needed help that Bear couldn't provide, who'd died while Bear sat helplessly by his bedside. This time he could help. Bear moved forward, closing the distance between them. The girl tensed but didn't run. Too weak to run even if she'd wanted to. He knelt down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. Then, with movements as gentle as he could manage, he scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. A child her age should weigh so much more. He could feel every bone in her small body. Feel the way she trembled, whether from fear or hunger or exhaustion. He couldn't tell. Probably all three. As he stood with her in his arms, he caught sight of something around her neck. A necklace, partially hidden by her torn clothing. Intricate beadwork in patterns that seemed vaguely familiar. But right now, all that mattered was getting her fed and safe. Bear began walking toward his cabin, carrying this child who could get him killed. With every step, he expected to hear war cries, to feel an arrow in his back, to pay the price for this act of kindness. But nothing came except the sound of his boots on the hard earth and the girl's rapid, shallow breathing against his chest. She didn't resist being carried. She'd gone limp in his arms, her small head resting against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat. Too fast, too weak, like a bird's heart, fragile and fading. As they reached the cabin, Bear whispered to her even though he knew she couldn't understand. "You're safe now. I've got you. You're safe." Maybe he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Because the truth was, neither of them was safe. Not anymore. Bear had just crossed a line that most settlers wouldn't dare approach. He'd chosen mercy over survival. compassion over common sense. And 20 miles away, at that exact moment, a Comanche search party was examining tracks in the dirt. Fresh tracks, leading straight toward Bear's ranch. And at the head of that search party rode Chief White Bull, his face a mask of fury and grief, because the tracks belonged to his daughter. His only daughter. The most precious thing in his world. The collision course was set. Bear just didn't know it yet. Inside the cabin, Bear set the girl down gently in his only chair. It was the chair Sarah used to sit in while she sewed, and for a brief moment, the memory threatened to overwhelm him. But there was no time for ghosts. This child needed immediate help. He moved quickly to the stove where yesterday's beef stew still sat in the pot. It was still warm, and the smell filled the small cabin. Bear also had fresh bread, baked just that morning. Baking was one of the things Sarah had taught him, and he'd kept up the habit. Gave his hand something to do on the long, lonely evenings. The moment the smell of food reached the girl, something changed in her eyes. That flicker of hope grew brighter. Her gaze locked onto the pot with an intensity that was almost frightening. This was a child who'd been starving, truly starving. Not just hungry, but dying of hunger. Bear ladled the thick stew into a wooden bowl. Chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots swimming in rich brown gravy. He grabbed a spoon and turned to hand it to her. That's when he got his first clear look at the necklace around her neck. His hand froze halfway to giving her the bowl. The beadwork. Those patterns. Where had he seen them before? And then it hit him like lightning. 2 weeks ago, sitting in the general store, his neighbor Pete Morrison had been describing Chief White Bull's family markings. Pete had been obsessed with Comanche culture, spent years studying them, learning their ways. And he described these exact patterns. The sacred beads worn by the family of Chief White Bull, the most powerful Comanche leader in the entire region. Bear's blood turned to ice water. This wasn't just any child. This was the daughter of a man who commanded hundreds of warriors. A man who'd never lost a battle against the U.S. cavalry. A man known for elaborate, terrifying revenge against anyone who wronged him or his people. And Bear had just brought her into his cabin. But it was too late to change course now. The girl was reaching for the bowl with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold it. Bear steadied her grip, helped her bring the spoon to her mouth. She ate with the desperate urgency of someone who hadn't seen food in days. Probably hadn't. She was shoveling the stew into her mouth so fast that Bear had to gently slow her down. "Easy, little one," he said softly. "Too fast and you'll be sick. You'll make yourself sick." She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. She slowed slightly, but the hunger in her eyes never diminished. She ate every drop of that stew, then looked up at him with an expression that asked for more. Bear gave her bread next, watching as she tore into it with the same desperate hunger. He brought her water from his bucket, clean and cool from the well. She drank like she'd been wandering the desert, which, in a way, she had been. As she ate, Bear's mind raced through the implications. He knew about Chief White Bull. Everyone on the frontier knew about Chief White Bull. The man had united several Comanche tribes under his leadership through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. He'd orchestrated raids that had terrified the cavalry. But more than that, he was known for his code of honor and his terrible swift revenge. If anything had happened to his daughter while she was in Bear's care, even if it wasn't Bear's fault, even if he'd saved her life, White Bull would have no choice but to make an example of him. The other tribes would expect it. His own warriors would demand it. A white man touching the chief's daughter, for any reason, would be seen as an unforgivable transgression. And Bear had not only touched her, he'd brought her into his home, fed her his food, in some twisted way that could be seen as claiming ownership, as taking a prize. The girl finished eating and looked up at Bear with something that might have been gratitude. But Bear couldn't feel any satisfaction in his good deed, because he knew what was coming. Somewhere out there, warriors were searching for this child. And when they found her trail leading to his cabin, they wouldn't wait to hear his explanation. They wouldn't care about his good intentions. They would come for blood. The girl's exhaustion finally overtook her full stomach. Within 30 minutes of eating, her eyes began to droop. She curled up in the chair, her small body finally relaxing now that hunger wasn't consuming her every thought. Bear covered her with his only blanket, the wedding quilt Sarah had made with her own hands. He stood there watching her sleep, this tiny girl who'd stumbled into his life and brought an army along with her. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across his property, Bear tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing, that saving a child's life was worth whatever consequences might follow. But that conviction was hard to maintain when the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the afternoon quiet. Bear moved to the window and peered out. His stomach dropped. 3 riders were coming hard toward his cabin. He recognized all of them. Cletus Hartwell, his nearest neighbor, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison, Pete's son, and Reverend Thomas from town. All 3 looked terrified. Bear stepped outside quickly, closing the door behind him to avoid waking the girl. He needed to keep their voices down. But Cletus was already shouting before his horse came to a full stop. "Bear, you damn fool. What in the hell are you thinking?" Cletus's face was bright red, a mix of anger and genuine fear. Deputy Morrison dismounted next, his hand resting on his gun belt in a way that suggested he wasn't sure whether Bear was friend or foe anymore. "Morrison here says he saw smoke signals coming from the hills this afternoon," Cletus continued. "The Comanche are looking for something. Or someone." Deputy Morrison stepped forward, his young face grave. "My father sent word from town. Chief White Bull's daughter went missing 3 days ago during a hunting party. Word is she wandered off and got lost in a storm." He paused, studying Bear's face with the careful attention of a lawman. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Comanche girl, would you, Bear?" The question hung in the air like a noose. Bear could lie, send them away, try to figure this out on his own. But these men had ridden out here to warn him. Despite their flaws, despite their prejudices, they'd come out of genuine concern. He owed them the truth. "She's inside," Bear said quietly, half-starved and exhausted. "I found her by the creek this morning. I couldn't just leave her to die." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Thomas was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I helped a hungry child," Bear replied. But even as he said it, even as he tried to make it sound reasonable, he could hear how naive it sounded. How impossibly naive. Cletus started pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "They're going to think you took her, Bear. Hell, they probably already think that. White Bull's been known to wipe out entire settlements for less than this." He stopped pacing and pointed at Bear. "Do you remember the Thompson Ranch? 1874? 15 people dead because someone stole a Comanche horse. A horse, Bear. And you've got his daughter." Deputy Morrison was already backing toward his horse. "I have to report this, Bear. It's my duty. But I'll give you a head start. Get her back to her people before they find you here. Try to reach them before they reach you." "In the dark?" Bear asked. "She can barely walk, Jake. And how exactly am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp without getting shot full of arrows before I can explain?" "That's your problem now," Morrison said, mounting his horse. "I'm riding to town to warn everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch. He might decide to send a message to every white settler in the territory." Reverend Thomas mounted up as well, shaking his head sadly. "The good Lord helps those who help themselves, Bear. But I'm not sure even he can help you now." As the 3 men rode away, their horses kicking up dust clouds in the fading light, Bear stood alone in the growing darkness. From inside the cabin, he could hear the girl's quiet breathing as she slept. Peaceful, innocent, unaware of the storm that was coming. Bear thought about saddling his horse and trying to find the Comanche camp. But that was suicide. He thought about loading her into his wagon and making a run for the nearest fort. But that would only make things worse, make him look like a kidnapper fleeing the scene. The truth was, there was no good way out of this. Every option led to the same place: a confrontation with one of the most feared war chiefs in Texas. And then, carried on the evening wind, came a sound that turned Bear's blood to ice. War drums, distant but growing closer. Not the chaotic noise of a raiding party. This was something far more organized, far more terrifying. The measured, methodical rhythm of warriors who'd already made their decision, who were coming not to negotiate but to execute judgment. They weren't waiting for morning. The Comanche were coming tonight. Bear rushed back into the cabin, his mind racing faster than his pounding heart. The war drums were getting louder. What had been a faint rhythm on the wind was now individual beats he could count. Slow, methodical, absolutely terrifying. This wasn't the sound of chaos. This was the sound of perfect military discipline. An army on the march. The girl stirred in the chair, awakened by the drums. Her eyes snapped open wide, and for the first time since Bear had found her, he saw recognition cross her face. She understood what those drums meant. She understood it better than he ever could. She started speaking rapidly in Comanche, pointing toward the door and then at herself. Her small hands were moving urgently, trying to communicate something critical. But the language barrier made it impossible for Bear to understand the specifics. He could only read the panic in her body language. Bear knelt down beside the chair, trying to keep his voice calm, even though everything in him wanted to scream. I know you can't understand me, little one. But I'm trying to help you. Those drums, that's your people coming for you, isn't it? The girl nodded vigorously, then grabbed Bear's shirt and pulled him toward the window. She pointed outside and held up both her small hands, opening and closing her fingers repeatedly. She was counting, showing him numbers. Bear counted along with her movements. 10, 20, 30. She kept going. 50, 70, 100. She kept counting until she'd indicated roughly 200. Bear's legs went weak beneath him. 200 warriors. He'd been hoping for maybe a dozen angry braves that he could somehow reason with. A small group he might be able to explain things to. But 200? That was enough to level every ranch within 50 miles. That was an army capable of starting a full-scale war. The drums stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. It was the silence before violence. The held breath before the scream. Bear moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and moonlight. Then, like ghosts materializing from the night itself, he began to make out shapes. They came in perfect formation. Warriors on horseback spread out in a wide semicircle that was slowly, methodically tightening around his cabin. Even in the pale moonlight, Bear could see the war paint on their faces. Elaborate patterns in white and red and black. He could see the feathers in their hair, the weapons in their hands. Bows, lances, rifles. These weren't men who had come to negotiate. These were warriors who'd come to deliver justice, as they understood it. The girl tugged on Bear's sleeve again, her urgency increasing. She gestured toward herself and then toward the door. She wanted to go to them, wanted to run out there. But Bear couldn't tell if that would help or make everything catastrophically worse. What if they thought he'd hurt her? What if they didn't believe she'd come to him willingly? What if his kindness looked like a crime? A single voice called out from the darkness, speaking in English. The accent was heavy, but the clarity was perfect. Every word chosen with precision and spoken with absolute authority. White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the girl, and perhaps you'll live to see morning. Bear's mouth went completely dry. That voice carried the weight of absolute command. This had to be Chief White Bull himself, the man whose daughter slept in Bear's chair, the man whose warriors surrounded Bear's home, the man who held Bear's life in his hands. Bear had heard stories about White Bull, how he'd united the fractured Comanche tribes through a combination of brilliant strategy and unwavering honor, how he'd never lost a battle against the cavalry, not through luck, but through understanding his enemy better than they understood themselves, how he enforced his own strict code of justice with terrifying consistency. And now Bear was about to face him, about to have a conversation that could end with everyone dead, about to try to explain why he'd done what any decent human being would do, and hope that decency was a language White Bull could understand. Bear stepped toward the door, but the girl grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. She shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with fear. Not for herself. For him. She was trying to warn him about something. But what? Then it hit him like a lightning bolt. The girl wasn't just the chief's daughter. She was the chief's only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her invaluable. Not just as family, but as the future of the bloodline. If anything had happened to her, if she'd been harmed in any way while in Bear's care, even accidentally, White Bull would have no choice but to make an example so terrible that other settlers would never forget. The political pressure alone would demand it. The other chiefs would be watching. The warriors would expect it. White Bull's own honor code would require it. Even if he personally believed Bear's intentions were good, he might have to kill Bear anyway just to maintain his authority. Bear realized with growing horror that saving the girl's life might have been the easy part. Now he had to prove to 200 armed warriors that he'd saved her, not stolen her. That he'd acted out of compassion, not calculation. That his kindness wasn't a crime. And he had maybe 30 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief White Bull lost his patience and turned Bear's ranch into a battlefield that would be remembered for generations. The girl was still holding his arm, still trying to communicate something urgent. Her eyes were pleading with him. Trust me, those eyes seemed to say. Trust me, and maybe we both survive this. Bear looked at her. Really looked at her. This child who'd stumbled onto his property starving and desperate. Who he'd fed without asking for anything in return. Who now was trying to save his life the way he'd saved hers. He made his decision. Bear opened the cabin door and stepped outside, hands raised high above his head in the universal gesture of surrender. The girl followed close behind him, staying near but not hiding. Together, they stepped into the moonlight, into the judgment, into whatever came next. The sight that greeted Bear when he stepped outside was something pulled straight from his darkest nightmares. 200 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property. They'd surrounded him completely. Every escape route blocked, every angle covered. The precision of their formation was terrifying in itself. This wasn't chaos or anger. This was military discipline at its finest. The war paint gleamed in the moonlight. Elaborate patterns that looked almost beautiful if you could forget they signified violence. Feathers adorned their hair, catching the slight breeze. And every weapon pointed directly at Bear. Arrows nocked, lances raised. A few rifles aimed with deadly intent. 200 ways to die, all focused on one unarmed cowboy standing in his doorway. At the front of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief White Bull. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, even seated on his horse. Broad-shouldered and radiating authority like heat from a fire. Silver streaked through his long black hair, marking him as a man of experience. But it was his face that truly captured Bear's attention. Carved from stone and fury, with eyes that seemed to burn with barely contained rage. This was a man capable of terrible violence. A man who'd earned his position through strength and will. A man who would not be easily swayed. The girl broke away from Bear's side and ran toward her father. She was calling out in rapid Comanche, her child's voice cutting through the tense silence. Bear expected to see relief on White Bull's face. Expected a joyful reunion between father and daughter. But instead, as the chief dismounted and knelt beside his child, his expression only grew darker. White Bull examined his daughter carefully, his large hands checking her for injuries with surprising gentleness. She spoke quickly, gesturing back toward Bear and the cabin. Her words tumbled over each other in her urgency to explain. But whatever she was saying, it wasn't making things better. Bear could read White Bull's body language. Every muscle was coiled like a spring. Every movement suggested violence barely restrained. Finally, White Bull stood and walked toward Bear. Each step was slow and deliberate. The other warriors remained mounted, but shifted their weapons. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, like rattlesnakes coiling before they strike. 200 men making tiny adjustments. 200 men preparing for their chief's signal. White Bull stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Bear could see every scar on the chief's bare chest. Marks of countless battles won. Evidence of a lifetime of warfare. Each scar a story of violence and survival. "My daughter tells me you fed her," White Bull said. His English was precise and cold, each word carefully chosen and delivered without warmth. "She tells me you gave her shelter." "Yes," Bear replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "She was starving. I couldn't let a child die." White Bull studied him for a long moment. His eyes seemed to look straight through Bear, searching for deception, weighing truth against experience. "She also tells me you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately return her to us." Bear's heart sank. This was the moment, the point where it all went wrong. "I was going to bring her back in the morning," he said, knowing how weak it sounded. "She was too weak to travel at night. I was going to—" "Perhaps," White Bull interrupted, "or perhaps you thought to keep her as a prize, to trade her back to us for cattle or horses or safe passage through our lands." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Bear could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him. Warriors waiting for their chief's command. Men who'd come here expecting violence and were being denied it. That kind of anticipation, that kind of battle readiness without release, could quickly turn explosive. "That's not true," Bear said, his voice growing firmer despite his fear. "I never wanted anything from you. I just couldn't watch a child suffer. That's all. Nothing more." "Words are wind, white man," White Bull replied. His tone was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it more frightening. "My people have heard pretty words before. We heard promises of peace from soldiers, who then killed our families. We heard guarantees of food that turned into starvation on reservations. We heard treaties that were broken before the ink dried. Why should your words mean more?" Bear had no answer to that. How do you defend yourself against history? How do you prove your individual innocence against the collective guilt of your people? He couldn't. And White Bull knew it. The chief raised his hand. One single gesture. And in perfect unison, every warrior drew back their bowstring. The sound of 200 arrows being knocked at once was like death itself taking a breath. A whisper of wood against leather multiplied into a terrible symphony. 200 arrowheads glinted in the moonlight, all pointed at Bear's chest. At this distance, even the worst archer couldn't miss. "You will prove your words," White Bull said quietly. The soft tone was more terrifying than any shout. "Or you will die where you stand." Bear's mind raced. How do you prove goodness to people who've only experienced evil from those who look like you? How do you demonstrate mercy to those who've received none? How do you explain that you're different when every person like you has claimed to be different before committing atrocities? Then inspiration struck. "Wait," Bear said, moving his hand slowly toward his pocket. Every warrior tensed, fingers tightening on bowstrings. Bear moved deliberately, carefully, making sure every motion was visible and non-threatening. "Your daughter was wearing this when I found her," he said, pulling out a small piece of torn fabric. "It caught on my fence post near the creek. I kept it because I thought you might want it. Thought you might want proof that I didn't harm her. That I found her exactly where I said I found her." He extended his hand, offering the fabric to White Bull. The chief took it and examined it carefully. Bear watched as recognition flickered in White Bull's eyes. It was indeed from his daughter's ceremonial dress, the one she'd been wearing when she disappeared. The distinctive pattern was unmistakable. "She came to my water source," Bear continued, his voice growing stronger now, finding his footing. "I could have driven her away, could have shot her as a trespasser. Most ranchers would have. But I didn't. I carried her to my home. I gave her my own food, my own blanket, and I asked for nothing in return. Nothing except that she survive." The girl suddenly spoke up, tugging on her father's arm. She pointed back toward the cabin urgently, insisting. White Bull looked confused, but gestured for Bear to follow them inside. As they walked, the tension didn't decrease, but it shifted. Changed into something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or the beginning of doubt. Inside the cabin, the girl moved with purpose. She pointed to the chair where she'd slept, then to the empty bowl where Bear had served her stew. She mimed eating, then sleeping, her small hands moving in an exaggerated pantomime to make sure her father understood. Then she turned to Bear and smiled. Actually smiled. It was the first genuine expression of happiness Bear had seen from her. But White Bull's attention had moved past his daughter, past the chair and the bowl. His eyes had locked onto something else entirely. On Bear's small wooden table sat the tintype photograph. Sarah and Matthew, frozen forever in that single captured moment. The image was worn from constant handling, the edges soft from Bear's fingers tracing their faces every single day. Surrounding the photograph were dried wildflowers, arranged carefully. A shrine to loss. "You have lost children too," White Bull said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. One father seeing another's grief laid bare. "My boy was about her age," Bear replied, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. 3 years ago. Cholera took him and my wife in the same week." He paused, struggling with the memories. "Maybe that's why I couldn't turn her away. I couldn't save my son, but I could save her." White Bull picked up the photograph with surprising gentleness. He studied the faces of Sarah and Matthew for a long moment. Outside, the warriors maintained their positions, but inside this small cabin, something profound was happening. A bridge being built across an impossible divide. The girl continued speaking rapidly in Comanche, apparently giving her father a complete account of everything that had happened. White Bull listened while still holding the photograph, and slowly he began to translate key portions. "She says you could have taken advantage. A lone white man with a Comanche child. You could have demanded ransom. You could have used her as a hostage, as protection for yourself. Instead, you simply fed her, gave her water, let her rest. Nothing more." Bear nodded. "I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I never have. I just work my land and try to live in peace. I've seen enough death to last a lifetime. I don't need to create more." White Bull set the photograph down carefully, making sure it was exactly as he'd found it. When he finally spoke, his words surprised Bear completely. "My warriors expected to find a kidnapper tonight. They expected to burn this place to the ground and take your scalp back as proof of our justice." He paused, his eyes moving from the photograph to Bear's face. "Instead, we find a man who showed kindness to a child who could have been his enemy." Bear felt hope flickering in his chest. Maybe this would end peacefully. Maybe understanding was possible after all. But then White Bull's expression hardened again. "But there is still a problem." Those 5 words crushed Bear's hope instantly. The chief's voice had gone cold again, the brief moment of connection closing like a door. "My warriors cannot return empty-handed," White Bull continued. "They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out to punish a crime and came back with nothing but words. Do you understand what I am saying?" Bear's blood turned to ice. Outside, he could hear the sound of restless movement. Horses shifting. Men growing agitated. Voices rising in what sounded like argument. The warriors had been ready for battle. They'd painted themselves for war. They'd ridden out expecting violence and glory. And now their chief was inside a cabin, talking with the enemy. White Bull gestured toward the door. "Some of my young warriors believe that any white man who touches a Comanche child, for any reason, must pay the price. They think I am being weak by talking instead of fighting. They think I have forgotten who we are, what we stand for." As if on cue, someone outside shouted in Comanche. The cry was picked up by other voices, growing louder, more insistent. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone perfectly. They wanted blood. They'd come here for justice, and justice in their eyes meant death. "What are you saying?" Bear asked, though he was terrified of the answer. White Bull looked at him for a long moment. I am saying that even though you meant no harm, you have created a situation that demands resolution. My people expected justice tonight. And if they don't get it, if I return with nothing but words and understanding, some will see it as weakness. And weakness in a chief leads to division. Division leads to chaos. Chaos leads to the death of the tribe. So I have to die, Bear said flatly. So you can maintain your authority. White Bull shook his head slowly. If I wanted you dead, you would already be dead. No. What I need is something else. Something that will satisfy both justice and honor. Something that will prove to my warriors that you are different from the other white men they have known. What? Bear asked desperately. Tell me what you need, and if it's in my power, I'll do it. You must come with us. Tonight. To our village. White Bull's eyes bored into Bear's soul. You must stand before our tribal council. Before the elders who have spent their entire lives watching your people break promises and steal land and murder our children. And you must convince them that your actions were pure, that you can be trusted. Bear's throat went dry. You want me to walk into a Comanche village, unarmed, and convince people who hate me to spare my life? Yes, White Bull said simply. It is the only way. If you refuse, my warriors will see it as proof of guilt. Proof that you have something to hide. They will demand your death, and I will have no choice but to give it to them. But if you come willingly, if you face judgment with courage, some of them might see you the way my daughter sees you. As a man who chose kindness over fear. Bear looked at the girl. She was watching him with those same desperate eyes from the creek. But this time, he realized she wasn't begging for his help. She was offering hers. She'd already saved his life once by telling her father the truth. Now she was asking him to trust her. To trust that courage would be rewarded. That truth would matter. It was an impossible ask. Every instinct Bear had screamed at him to refuse. To take his chances here rather than walk voluntarily into what could be his execution. But then he thought about Sarah and Matthew. About the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. About the values they tried to live by. And he knew he couldn't refuse. Let's go, Bear said quietly. His voice was steadier than he felt. If I'm going to die, at least I'll die knowing I did the right thing. That has to count for something. White Bull's expression shifted slightly. Not quite approval, but something close to respect. He nodded once, then turned and walked out of the cabin. Bear followed, the girl walking close beside him. As they emerged into the moonlight, the restless warriors immediately went silent. 200 pairs of eyes watching, judging, waiting to see what would happen next. White Bull spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying across the assembled warriors. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he understood the reactions. Some warriors nodded. Others looked angry, dissatisfied. A few shouted what sounded like objections. This wasn't a unified army. This was a collection of men with different opinions about justice, and White Bull was walking a tightrope trying to satisfy them all. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you were Bear right now, standing in front of 200 warriors, about to ride into their village to face judgment for doing the right thing, what would you be thinking? Would you go? Would you run? Would you fight? Tell me in the comments, because what Bear decided in this moment would determine not just his fate, but the fate of every settler and every Comanche in the territory. One man's courage could prevent a war, or his death could start one. The ride to the Comanche village took 3 hours through terrain Bear had never seen before. They traveled through hidden canyons and secret paths that settlers didn't know existed. As they rode, Bear began to understand something profound. His people, the white settlers, thought they knew this land. They'd drawn maps and claimed territories and planted flags. But they were blind children stumbling through a house owned by others. The Comanche knew every rock, every creek, every path. They knew this land the way a man knows his own face. As they approached the village, Bear could see dozens of fires flickering in the darkness. Teepees arranged in careful patterns. The sound of voices, low and urgent, as word spread of their arrival. People emerged from their homes. Women, children, elders. all stopping to watch the white man being brought into their midst. Bear had never felt so exposed in his life. Every eye on him carried decades of justified anger. He represented every broken treaty, every murdered child, every stolen piece of land. He was the embodiment of their suffering, and he was walking right into their judgment. The tribal council convened immediately despite the late hour. This was too important to wait. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a central fire, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Bear stood in the center of that circle, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to enter this sacred space and live to tell about it. If he lived to tell about it, White Bull spoke first, his voice formal and respectful as he addressed the elders. He explained the circumstances of his daughter's disappearance, her rescue, the decision to bring Bear here for judgment. The elders listened without interruption, their faces revealing nothing. Then came another voice. A massive warrior stepped forward from the crowd, his face covered in ceremonial scars. This was Broken Arrow, and the moment he began speaking, Bear knew he was in trouble. The warrior's voice was filled with rage and grief. White Bull whispered a translation. "This is Broken Arrow. His younger brother was killed by cavalry soldiers 6 months ago. They promised peace, then attacked without warning. His brother was 25, left behind a wife and 2 children. Broken Arrow believes all white men are liars and murderers." As Broken Arrow spoke, his voice rising with each word, other warriors began to murmur agreement. Bear could see the council splitting. Some seemed sympathetic to White Bull's position. Others clearly agreed with Broken Arrow's call for blood. The debate went back and forth in Comanche for what felt like hours. Bear stood in the center, understanding nothing except the occasional gesture in his direction. Sometimes those gestures seemed curious. Often they seemed hostile. Always they reminded him that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. Broken Arrow stepped directly into White Bull's path, speaking rapidly and pointing his lance at Bear. The challenge was unmistakable. Follow the old ways of blood for blood, or be seen as weak by the younger warriors. White Bull's response was quiet but firm. Authority versus grief-fueled anger. Chief against warrior. But Broken Arrow wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, close enough now that the point of his lance almost touched White Bull's chest. This wasn't just about Bear anymore. This was about the future of the tribe itself, about whether they would follow the path of eternal vengeance or find some new way forward. That's when the girl did something that no one expected. She stepped between the 2 men, this tiny child inserting herself into a confrontation between warriors. And she began speaking in rapid, passionate Comanche. Her young voice cut through the tension like a knife. Bear watched as Broken Arrow's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. The girl's words were having an effect. Other warriors were leaning in to hear. Even the elders, who'd maintained their stoic expressions throughout, were now listening intently. White Bull translated quietly, his own voice showing surprise. "She is telling them exactly what happened. How she got lost in the storm. How she wandered for days without food or water. How she expected to die alone on the prairie until you found her." The girl continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. She pointed to Bear, then to herself, then mimed eating and sleeping. She was telling the story of her rescue in vivid detail, and even the warriors who had been supporting Broken Arrow were listening now. "She is telling them about your family photograph," White Bull continued, his voice soft, "about how she could see the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. She is saying that you helped her because you understood loss, not because you wanted to hurt our people." Broken Arrow lowered his lance slightly, but his face still showed doubt. He spoke again, this time directly to the girl. Bear caught one word he recognized. Wasichu, the Comanche term for white man, and definitely not a friendly one. The girl's response was immediate and fierce. She stepped closer to Broken Arrow and spoke with such intensity that several warriors actually stepped back. This 8-year-old child was challenging a war veteran. and she wasn't backing down. She is asking him if he has children. White Bull translated, surprise evident in his voice. She is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his child was dying of hunger in the wilderness. The question hit Broken Arrow like an arrow to the chest. His lance dropped to his side completely. He stared at the girl, then at Bear, then at the ground. The moral calculation shifting in his mind. Father to father, warrior to child, human to human. But the girl wasn't finished. She turned to address all the warriors now, her words directed at the entire assembly. Bear could see the effect rippling through the crowd. Hard faces beginning to soften. Angry eyes becoming thoughtful. She is telling them that judging you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. White Bull translated. She is saying that if we punish mercy, we become the monsters that the white man believes us to be. The silence that followed was absolute. 200 warriors sat motionless, processing the words of an 8-year-old girl who had just challenged their deepest beliefs about justice, revenge, and honor. Finally, Broken Arrow spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in that silence, it carried to everyone. White Bull's translation came slowly, as if he too was struggling with the weight of the words. He says that perhaps the spirits sent his brother a teacher instead of an enemy. He says that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Bear felt something shift in the air around them. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. White Bull looked at Bear with something that might have been respect. My daughter has done something remarkable, the chief said quietly. She has turned a war party into a council meeting. But now comes the final test. The elders must decide. If you're as amazed by this little girl's courage as I am, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next will show you why children sometimes understand truth better than adults ever can. The ancient elder stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. He was easily the oldest person Bear had ever seen, his face a map of wrinkles, his hair completely white. But his eyes were sharp and clear, eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, that had watched his people go from rulers of the plains to refugees in their own land. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of wisdom. White Bull translated, his tone reverent. He says the spirits have sent us a test tonight, not a test of our ability to make war. We have proven that many times over. This is a test of our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Bear felt his knees go weak with relief. But the elder wasn't finished. He continued speaking, his eyes never leaving Bear's face. You will be granted safe passage back to your land. But more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Bear could barely speak. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. The elder held up his hand, indicating there was more. There is one condition, White Bull translated. You must promise that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Bear said without hesitation. I swear it. Any Comanche who comes to my door will find help, not violence. I give you my word. The elder nodded, seeming satisfied. Then he spoke again, and White Bull pulled something from a pouch at his belt. A small leather cord with a single blue bead, intricately carved. Wear this always, White Bull said, handing it to Bear. Any Comanche who sees it will know you are under our protection. It marks you as a friend of the people. It is a sacred trust. Do not betray it. Bear took the cord with trembling hands and tied it around his neck. The bead rested against his chest, over his heart. It weighed almost nothing, but felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. What happened next surprised everyone in the circle. The girl ran to Bear and threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. She spoke in broken English for the first time, her words halting but clear. Thank you for saving me. Now I save you. Bear knelt down and hugged her back, tears streaming down his face. For the first time since Sarah and Matthew died, he was crying. But these weren't tears of grief. These were tears of redemption, of hope, of the understanding that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely broken. White Bull placed his hand on Bear's shoulder. "You have given me back my daughter. But more than that, you have given us all a gift. You have shown us that not all white men are enemies. That sometimes mercy can bridge the deepest divide. That courage looks like kindness." As dawn broke over the prairie, Bear rode back to his ranch. But this time, he wasn't riding alone. He wasn't riding as a prisoner or a condemned man. He rode as an honored guest, with warriors as his escort. Two cultures that had been on the brink of violence had instead found a bridge. And that bridge was built on one cowboy's simple act of kindness and one little girl's courage to defend it. Bear's ranch became something unprecedented in the Texas territory. A neutral ground where Comanche and settlers could meet safely. The only place for 100 miles where peace existed. Where trade happened without violence. Where conversations replaced gunfire. It wasn't easy. There were settlers who called Bear a traitor, who said he'd gone soft, who warned that he was being used by the savages. And there were Comanche who viewed his friendship with White Bull as betrayal of their cause. But Bear didn't care what they thought. He'd made a promise, and he kept it. Over the years, dozens of Comanche came to his door. Sometimes they were hungry, sometimes wounded, sometimes just tired and needing a safe place to rest. And every single time, Bear kept his word. He fed them, sheltered them, asked for nothing in return. The blue bead around his neck became known throughout the territory, a symbol that this white man was different, that this place was safe. Bear never got rich, never became famous. No songs were written about him. No monuments were built in his honor. He lived the rest of his life as a simple rancher, working his cattle and mending his fences. But he lived knowing something more valuable than wealth or fame. He lived knowing that he'd chosen mercy when it would have been easier to choose fear. And that choice had saved lives, had prevented war, had proven that the divide between peoples wasn't as unbridgeable as everyone believed. Every year on the anniversary of that night, a young Comanche woman would visit Bear's ranch. She was no longer a starving child, but a respected member of her tribe, a translator and peacekeeper who dedicated her life to preventing the conflicts that had defined her childhood. She became the bridge that her father, for all his wisdom and power, couldn't be. She showed both sides that the enemy was human, that understanding was possible, that peace was a choice, not a fantasy. Bear lived to be 73 years old. When he finally died, it was peacefully in his sleep, his body simply deciding it had worked enough. At his funeral, something happened that had never occurred before in the Texas territory. Comanche and settlers mourned together. They stood side by side, these people who'd been enemies for generations, and they grieved for a man who'd shown them a different way. They buried Bear on the hill next to Sarah and Matthew. And on his grave, along with the wildflowers that had marked his family's resting place for decades, the Comanche placed sacred objects, feathers and beads and tokens of respect. His grave became a shrine not to war or violence, but to the quiet courage of doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. The lesson of Bear's life isn't complicated. Courage isn't always about fighting. It isn't always about standing your ground with a rifle in your hands. Sometimes courage looks like feeding a hungry child when everyone tells you it's dangerous. Sometimes it looks like choosing mercy over fear. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can prevent the greatest tragedies. Bear's story proves that one person can make a difference, that choosing compassion over convenience can change the world. But it takes real courage, the kind that risks everything for what's right, the kind that sees a starving child and thinks not about politics or safety or what the neighbors will say, but simply about saving a life. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see courage, hit that subscribe button. Because we have hundreds more stories like this. Stories of ordinary people who chose extraordinary kindness. Stories that prove the best weapon against hate is a simple act of human decency. Click on the video on your screen right now. The ending will leave you speechless. Click it now. You won't regret it.